and they're shared by a group of people. Culture is basically assumptions and values and beliefs shared by the same group of people. So what types of cultures exist? Well, there's national culture, there's ethnic culture, there's regional culture, there's urban and neighborhood culture. Yeah, I remember I had an Hispanic meeting in Chicago at one of the churches there, and I spent the night in a hotel. Interesting neighborhood, Bucktown. You guys been to Bucktown? Bucktown is its own culture. Do you believe that? Do you understand that? If you haven't been to Bucktown, it's a different culture. Because you go in there, they're not with suit and ties, they're in the hotel. You know, they got their funny hairdos and so forth. And then you go into the room. The room, you actually use a key, not a key card, to get in. They don't have I wanted to iron my shirt. They don't have iron or ironing board. It's a very relaxed type of environment. And you see young people all outside in Bucktown. And this was Friday night, just out there talking and laughing and that kind of thing. I felt very much out of place because I was in a different what? Culture, a different culture, a different culture. Organizational, that's obvious too. Generations, their own culture as well. You can look at life as this way. There's first human nature. You can individual. There's human nature. We're all human beings. We have our defects and faults. But then culture falls underneath the iceberg. And this is the iceberg theory of culture, which you have cultural artifacts and systems. You have values and assumptions. And then you have individual personality. Example being, I'm Puerto Rican. Okay, at least I come from a Puerto Rican background. I wasn't born in Puerto Rico, but I come from a Puerto Rican background. So Puerto Rican backgrounds, we have certain words and phrases and things and things that are done that aren't done in other cultures, but it's just because of our artifacts and systems, but then also values too as well. There are some things that are similar as human nature goes. Individual personality is very much something that each of us hold individually. What is cultural intelligence? Read this with me again. The ability to function, communicate, and manage effectively in complex and changing cultural contexts, which includes ethnicity, nationality, generational, or organizational. So you're functioning and communicating and managing in a complex cultural context. Cultural intelligence guides you to better cross-cultural communication in the following steps. And 1, you acquire knowledge and understand the social dynamics. 2, you reflect on what you hear, see, and hear. And 3, you plan and adjust. So acquire knowledge, reflect, and then you plan and adjust according to the situation. There are some benefits in having it. You see differences. You honor differences. You understand details. You build bridges. And you connect and communicate. I tell you, this understanding of cultural intelligence, when you're working with as many ethnic groups as I work with, like, for example, Korean and African and Burmese, for example, to understand how they think and work. We all are Seventh-day Adventists, but even as Seventh-day Adventists, we have our what? Our cultures. We have our cultures. We have our differences. And it's the idea is understanding and appreciating it and seeing how God blesses them. CQ, I feel, shouldn't just be for the diplomats, or it shouldn't be just for the politicians, just be for government. It should be for mission, too, for the church, too, as well. Is that right? Especially when you consider, have any of you been to a general conference session? How many of you have been to a general conference session? If you've been to a general conference session, you are blown away by the variety of cultures that are there. And you wonder, how do we get along? How do we get along? It's by the grace and the power of the Holy Spirit. Is that right? It brings us all together. But it's good to know where we are, that we are different. So we can help appreciate, understand, and not be misunderstood. Sometimes there are things that you do that are offensive. And we have to understand where those offenses lie. There are things that we do we didn't realize, whoa, they really like that. They really like that, you know, that kind of thing. So it's indispensable for our mission. And I read the scripture here in Revelation 7 this morning, a multitude. We're going to see a multitude. We're going to be part of a multitude. Nations, tribes, tongues, and people. And they're crying out, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. What does the Bible say about diversity? Well, we're all one. God made us as one. And then in the specific verses that talk about that, Acts 17 said, from one man God made every nation of the human race that they should inhabit the whole earth. Joel 2:28 prophesies that God would pour out his spirit on how many people? All people. The first converts of the church were people from many different parts of the Roman Empire. Why did God intentionally, and I say intentionally, pour out his Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost? Why? There was people from every part of the Roman Empire. And that was a place where God wanted to pour it out so that so the gospel would go throughout the world. Galatians 3:28 makes it clear that Christ came to tear down the walls that divide the people. The reality is, however, as part of sin, sin has brought to the world the ability to discriminate, to show bias against people who are different from us. That's a reality. We all tend to discriminate. Bible brings it out. Eve put Satan over God. Adam put Eve over God. Cain discriminated against his brother. Pharaoh discriminated against Israel. Moses' sister, Miriam, discriminated against his wife, Zipporah. The apostles initially discriminated against people who were not from Israel. I brought an example this morning of, for example, the apostles trying to push away a Syro-Phoenician woman. Do you remember reading that story? Or remember if those of you here this morning, they were pushing away because she was not a Jew, she was a Gentile, whom Jesus mentioned, because they were thinking it, as her being a what? A dog. Can you imagine that? Discrimination, extreme. That was something Jesus had to teach them, that we're all part of the family of God. When you look at the U.S., of course, we have a history of discrimination. That's a reality. By the way, this is an interesting book, A History of Intolerance in America. We have that history. Not something they taught me when I was in elementary school or even high school regarding the level of intolerance that we have done towards, for example, Native Americans. Of course, I heard about the blacks. I didn't know as clearly about the Native Americans to what extreme that happened. European immigrants, even Italians at one point, who were told that they were not to be part of us. Mormons, of course. Jews, Mexicans. Did you know that there was a law for a Chinese to it was forbidden? Supreme Court judgment that said Chinese were not to be part of the United States citizenship at one point. There was that extremeness against it. Of course, Japanese, because of the internments during World War II, that was a reality. But you know, the United States isn't alone in intolerance. Here's a map of the prejudices in Mexico. Even Mexicans have their biases. The southern Mexicans look at the northern Mexicans very differently. The eastern Mexicans and the west Mexicans tend to look very differently towards each other. It's an example, and you can look that in other countries and other contexts. Why? Because of one word: sin. Sin gives us that ability to hate each other and to look at each other in a negative way. Here's an example of what the media can be discriminatory. I don't know if you can read that or not, but pretty much here, I can read it from my vantage point here. Let me see here. In the context of what it's saying here, interesting enough, it brings out the point that here's one group, the guy at the top. He's looting. He's described as looting from a store at the top. And what color is he? He's black. But look at the bottom. Here's a couple here, and they're also bringing food from a store, but it's not called looting. It's called what? Finding. Now, why is one group of people, one person described looting, and another person who is called what? Another group of people called finding. Even the media can tend to discriminate. based upon what they see. That's just a reality. The church, are we immune to the idea of discrimination in our history? Did you know that the GC and Southern Union cafeterias were segregated at one point? In fact, even EMC, you know what EMC stands for? Emmanuel Missionary College, which is now what? Andrews University. Blacks sat on one table, whites in the other table. The way Southern Union cafeteria was desegregated, what is interesting. A very famous evangelist, ever heard of E.E. Cleveland? He tells a story that when he was newly arrived to Southern Union, they had a meeting of all the pastors in the Southern Union. And they had a meeting that went on for a while, and then they broke up for lunch. And when they broke up for lunch, the white pastors got up and started to head towards the cafeteria. But the black pastors were what? Sitting down. They were sitting down. And E. Cleveland got up, and they looked at him, and they said, we don't do that here. He says, what? And then he realized that the white men would go to the cafeteria and eat, and then after they were done, the blacks could go and eat. He didn't like that. And so he got up, and the president of the Southern Union at the time looked at him, and they looked at each other for, I don't know, a minute. They were just staring at each other. You know, E. Cleveland was tall, and so was and he looked at each other for a while, and E. Cleveland wasn't going to let go. He just looked at him, and finally, the Southern Union president says, okay, you guys can come too. That was the first time black and white preachers could eat together in the Southern Union cafeteria. General Conference's cafeteria was segregated too as well.
What year was that?
I was in the probably in the 30s or 40s, I think it was around that time. Around that time of the civil rights. Southern white churches would not allow blacks to join them. It wasn't until a group of Oakwood students against the by the way, you can read some of these stories in the book Protest and Promise by, I forget his name now. But anyway, that's an interesting book that tells the stories. But it was because a group of students from Oakwood, wasn't a university at the time, Oakwood College, they went over to try to go to integrate into the Huntsville white church. They were stopped at the door. They said, no, you're not allowed. They went back, and the guys and the administration at Oakwood says, don't cause any trouble, but they went back anyway. This time, they contacted the local news media, And when that happened, then they had to go through some of their ways of doing business, and they finally said, okay, you can come in. You can come in. That was only when it happened under abuse. Lucille academies had quota limits for blacks. You can only have so many blacks in an academy. After that, you weren't allowed in. Have you heard of the name Lucille Byard? Lucille Byard was a woman from the East Coast that wanted to go and be treated for cancer at Washington Sanitarium. By the way, it's a picture of Washington Sanitarium, way old, way back. And she wanted to go to Washington Sanitarium. She got to go into Washington Sanitarium. She had permission to go to Washington Sanitarium until they looked at her description of her race, because she looked white, but she was really black. And when they saw that she was black, they says, no, I'm sorry, we can't have you here. You need to go to Freedman Hospital, just down the other side of town. That's where they treat blacks. Well, she went over there, and about a month later, she died, but it caused a real uproar. And by the way, it was the Lucille Byard situation that had a direct impact in leading to decide to have separate conferences. Separate conferences. It led to the direct discussion of saying, finally, we're going to have to do something. And they allowed, where it wasn't allowed before, they allowed blacks to have their own conferences from that one particular incident that took place. Are you biased? Well, here's an interesting video. Let's see if it works here. Is it working? Let's see if it works. Maybe I'll try it this way. Oh, I see what I did.
Okay, do me. Something stereotypical so I can get it really quick.
Okay, I like your food.
Outback Steakhouse. I'm Australian, mate.
Pam,
No.
Pam, come on. I like your food. No, come on. Stir the pot. Stir the melting pot, Pam. Let's do it. Let's get ugly. Let's get real.
Okay. If I have to do this, based on stereotypes that are totally untrue, that I do not agree with, you would maybe not be a very good driver.
Oh, man, am I a woman?
He let it out, didn't he? He let it out. He had a bias, didn't he? He had a certain bias. Now, I brought up earlier in the sermon this morning this idea of microaggressions. But what is a microaggression? A microaggression is subtle but offensive comment or action directed at a minority or other non-dominant group that is often unintentional or unconsciously reinforces a stereotype. You see an aggression, microaggression such as, I don't see you as black. You know, there's explicit bias, which back in the 50s and 60s, for example, it was very open. You know, we don't want you blacks here. We don't want the people of color here. This is whites only. That was back in the 50s and 60s. That's not acceptable anymore, theoretically. However, the reality is there are certain amounts of behaviors that are not explicit but more implicit based upon our biases. And I'm going to show you an example here. An interesting example video here, kind of humorous, but interesting to see how implicit bias plays itself out. Oops, let me try this. Guess I'll touch on here again. All right.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Well, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean. But I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Hamshasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well. I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Weird? Must be a Korean thing.
Now, what stands out about that story? What stands out about that story that it reveals his misunderstanding or implicit bias? Did he consider her American? No. In fact, he said he was a regular American, as if all Americans look like him. You see that? As all Americans look like him when you think about it, you know? He didn't see that because she looked a certain way, she couldn't be the way he perceived her to be. Interesting. We are called to be culturally competent. That's what the Bible says, right? John 13. So now I am giving you a new commandment. Love each other. Just as I loved you, you should love each other. Your love for another will prove to the what? To the what? To the world that you are my disciples. By the way, do you recognize any of these young people here? They're from Epic. Epic Church. Epic Church, interesting enough, started out just getting known in the community by offering after church free hugs. And they got to be known as a free hug church, interesting enough. And they're very community, Booktown type of community. I went out one time with them doing the free hug thing too as well. It felt a little weird, but then after a while I got into it, as far as that goes. But the reality is they were trying to demonstrate to the world that they were family, the family of God. Cultural intelligence, the capacity to function effectively in a variety of cultural contexts. The idea is if you're in Bucktown, you can relate to them. If you're in Harlem, you can relate to them. If you're in a context of where you're in a context of a different culture, whether it be overseas and so forth, you have the ability to communicate cross-culturally, knowing what to look for in communicating with them. The idea is there are three things, essential things you have to know. First, you have to know yourself. Know what? Yourself. Who you are. Where are you? Then you get to know what? Other people. And then following other people, then you're able to work with other people, right? Maybe lead other people too as well. So you have to know yourself, you have to know others, and you have to lead together. That looking at yourself is looking at yourself, where you come from. And I, for example, was a student. I went back in the 70s. I went overseas for 1 year to Bolivia. Now, I speak Spanish, they speak Spanish. Their Spanish is different than my Spanish. Believe me, their words are different than my words. Puerto Rican Spanish is very different than Bolivian Spanish. I came back from Bolivia after a year, and my mom says, "What are you speaking?" Because it wasn't the same Spanish she was used to, you see as well? You adapt and you grow into the context. So the idea is adapting to the way that people are and helping to be able to minister to them in a special way. But you have to know yourself, where you came up, where you are, where you came from, what your biases are, and so forth. We offer at the Lake Union a specific profile that we make available for those who we train in cultural intelligence. It's called CQ Profile. What it is that it analyzes who you are so that then you can be able to communicate with people outside and recognize where they come from. So we analyze 4 areas. And this is something that I'm going to be doing, in fact, a couple of weeks to the seminary students at Andrews, where we analyze their ability to communicate cross-culturally in 4 areas. CQ Drive, CQ Knowledge, CQ Strategy, and CQ Action. CQ Drive is your interest, drive, and confidence to adapt to multicultural situations. If you have a desire, a burning desire to reach people outside of their culture, I was so impressed with the Spanish pastor in Chicago when he said he had this lady here who was ministering to, even though she wasn't Spanish, she was Chinese. Now, if I were to say if his drive was high or low, I would say it was high because he didn't know a word of Chinese. He doesn't know the background of Chinese, but he wanted to what? To minister to her. CQ Knowledge, your understanding about cultures are similar and different. Typically, people have come a little lower in that because, for example, they say, well, I don't know more than just English. I'm just English. So they come a little lower and so forth. But in any case, we identify your knowledge in cultural intelligence, your strategy, your awareness and ability to plan for multicultural interactions. And then CQ Action, your ability to adapt when relating and working interculturally. Now, those of you who are here, I talked about how the Fort Wayne Church took on the amazing task of welcoming people who had come fresh from a refugee camp in Thailand to administer these people who were Korean. Now, it was amazing to me because we didn't know anything about Korean. But I do know this. my people wanted to help them. So they had high CQ what? Drive, CQ drive. Now, the next thing is, how do you help them? So now you start acquiring what? Knowledge. So you learn about their foods. What are you going to get? What are you going to buy? That kind of thing. You learn a little few words here and there in the Korean language. So you do that. The next thing after that is CQ what? Strategy. So now you know what they need, you know what they eat, so you buy what they eat and what they eat. Then following that, you put it into action. So we welcomed them at the airport, brought them into the hotel, into the apartment where they're in, and now we have a Korean congregation. Seventh Day Adventist in Fort Wayne. What do you say? That's because of the evangelistic drive they had to reach out to those who were needing their attention. So if you take the assessment, we measure where you are. We measure if you're high or low in drive. If you don't really want to work with cultures, you're going to be way down on the blue area. But if you are high, then you would go to the red area. CQ knowledge, the same way. The CQ strategy, CQ action. Now, the interesting thing is, can you change IQ? No, you can't. Can you change EQ? Yeah, you can. Can you change CQ? Yes. Definitely. Of all the different intelligent quotients, EQ and CQ are the ones that you can change if you want to reach out beyond them. Again, I mentioned the fact that part of culture involves cultural values and assumptions. And so when you're working with a different culture, you have to recognize that every culture has certain values where they're high and low. For example, individualism and collectivism, low power distance versus high power distance, low uncertainty avoidance versus high uncertainty avoidance, cooperative versus competitive, short term versus long term, low context versus high context, being versus doing, universalism versus particularism, neutral versus effective. They say, well, what is all that stuff, Pastor? What does that all mean? Very simple. The individualistic culture is one that says, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it my way. This is the way I'm going to do it. The collective culture is where they work together. So the more European countries tend to be, and American especially, are very individualistic. They make their decisions on their own and so forth, pretty much, and don't necessarily look for help, but they can get help, but necessarily it's not a big thing. Go to Africa, it's a different story. We do things how? Together. It's not a matter of me, it's a matter of we. It's always that way in Africa, and by the way, in Inter-America too as well. Power distance, that's a biggie. Power distance is where high power distance and low power distance. High power distance, the man at the top, is where you look at the man in charge and say, and you listen to him, and he gives the what? Orders or directions. In low power distance, we work together. Where does the United States tend to fall in? Huh? No, low power actually, for the most part. For example, in our denomination, for example, it's very much low power where we all work together and talk together through a lot of committees. I know about committees, more committees than I want to be on, but it's all committee based, that's the way it is. However, in South America, when I attended a meeting of pastors in South America, wow, is that right, Pastor Alva? The pastor rules, the president rules. Did you know that the South American division president does not like what's happening in a local church? You listen to the South American division president. He will actually go and give the directions of where to go. High power distance hold. That's certainly bad. That's just the way they what? Do things, all right? That's the way they do things. Uncertainty avoidance. There are those who are ready to leap and go where no man has gone before. But there's others who just want to what? Step by step, step by step. Make sure we go things the right way. Is that right? Certain cultures are that way. Cooperative and competitive. A matter of working together and to achieve a goal, competitive. First one in line, we win. Time orientation. This is interesting there, where, if you say And if you say at the conference committee, you're going to have a meeting at 2 o'clock, you're going to have a meeting at 2 o'clock. However, if I go to a Hispanic board meeting, it may be 2 o'clock, it may be 2:30. It's just a matter of what? Time is relative, right? Context, direct and indirect. This is something that I had the weirdest thing to adapt. In talking to Koreans, they talk and we talk and go over things. And I had a meeting with Korean pastors, and they talked and talked. They were very like this, you know what I mean? But they don't really tell you what they're thinking, you see? And until I stepped out, and I said, you know, I'm going to step out and let you guys talk among yourselves, because I was kind of like, they have high power distance, you know, type of thing. But they weren't telling me what they think. So I stepped out, they talked among themselves, they tell me, okay. And this pastor who was bicultural, he says, this is what they really want, you know. So you go kind of in, and that's maddening for Americans. That's maddening for Americans. But it's normal in the Asian context, where the American, this is what I want, this is what we're going to do, this is it, right? That's different. It's different. Being versus doing. In the U.S., I guess we're pretty much doing. When you want to get something done, you do it. Being, where, well, you want to think about it. Let's think about it and reflect on it and not just put the whole lot of stuff into it. Interesting, I have a prayer conference committee that meets, it's going to meet tomorrow. We've already had 2 meetings. I could tell those who were ready to do it, and there were those who were, let's pray about it. Pray about it. There's those who just get, you know, that kind of way of behaving, that way of behaving. Universalism versus particularism. I wish I could show a video here that's there, but in this one, universalism, we all go by the same, we all do the same thing. Pretty much we agree, so this is the rules, and everybody follows the what? The rules. Particularism, there is exceptions to the rule. Is that right? Exceptions to the rule. And some cultures vary quite a bit, quite a bit. For example, when I was in Bolivia, I had the occasion where, you know, I had to go visit somebody, and, well, not visit, I had to visit a certain place, but to visit a certain place, the person who was in charge, he says, well, you're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to do this. However, I could make an exception. I could make an exception if you, and then he held out his hand, you know what I mean? That kind of, held out his hand, that kind of thing. In the U.S., the rules apply to everyone. No exceptions, no exceptions. But in other cultures, there are exceptions. That's particularism versus universalism. Expressiveness, non-expressive, neutral, expressive, effective. Those who are very expressive, you know, who wave their hands and speak loud and so forth, and those who are very neutral. The African culture, the choir, would you call them neutral or effective? Definitely effective, right? I mean, they were just moving and rolling, that kind of thing. Go to African American church, neutral or effective? Effective. Go to another church, a German church, very neutral. When I started out pastoring the Fort Wayne church, which is English church, by the way, pretty much Anglo for the most part, they started out as neutral. But they got used to me after 3 years. And they became more, what? Expressive, effective, that kind of thing. That was just the way it happened. Now, interesting enough, they also made an analysis of 10 global clusters around the world. Everybody falls in one of these clusters. Anglo cluster, Latin Europe cluster, Nordic Europe cluster, Germanic Europe cluster, Eastern Europe, European cluster, Latin American culture, Arab culture, Sub-Saharan culture, Southern Asia, Confucian culture cluster. They're all different clusters. Each cluster has their own, pretty much, for a general, not universally, because you can't stereotype people, but for the most part, some of them fall very strongly in a certain amount of those values. For example, the sub-Saharan African, very collective in their approach. Also high power context, and so forth. Anglo cluster, very individualistic. Americans, the United States of America, is the most individualistic of all the different nations in the world, in the Anglo cluster too as well. I recommend, if you want to get into more detail, get this particular book by David Livermore, Expand Your Borders. You can get it, the cheapest way is to get it on your iPad if you have it, but otherwise you can order the book. Very interesting, goes into great detail on all these different clusters as well. In fact, there's a video series called Great Courses. Have you ever heard of Great Courses? You get all these different classes that you take and so forth. There's one particular class on great clusters, on great courses called Cultural Intelligence. And he gets into quite a bit of detail. The professor is, and David, he goes into quite a bit of detail as far as what these clusters are all about, or else you can read the book too as well. And then what you can do is that you can analyze them. Again, it's hard to see, but then you can analyze where you fall, because the profile not only indicates what values you have, but where you tend to lean in the clusters itself. For example, in the case of cooperative, there was if you were more towards this way, you were more on this way, this kind of, what does that say, long-term, and it indicates which cluster you might fall into based upon that. So you can identify that. The idea, basically, if you learn one thing out of this, is who you are, so you can evaluate where they are too as well. You are aware of yourself. It's called mindfulness, where you develop a sensitivity to one's reactions. You kind of just sitting and observing. By the way, it's one thing I learned from a pastor who baptized me. I noticed that he was a man who not only preached, but he also looked at people. And he would look and look and look. And just by looking at them and by listening to them, he figured out where they were. Here's an example of one incident like this. Remember this story? Do you know this story? The widow's what? Mite. Now, how did that come about? Well, Jesus is just kind of looking, and he's seeing all these people, these men who are so proud that they're giving all these what? All this accumulation of coins so they could get all the praise from the people and so forth. And in contrast, Jesus is just looking. And of course, he's God, so he not only looks at the outside, but looks on the inside. But he sees this woman just simply putting in the coins, putting in the coins, putting in, just took 2 coins actually. And he realizes who he is, and he elevates her, that she gave more than everyone else because she gave all that she what? Had. That's being mindful. You're looking outside of yourself and you're looking at others. I gave the story this morning, those of you who weren't here, of these 3 young men, African-American men, who were sitting in a restaurant. And they were in the restaurant. One of them looks at an elderly woman who is sitting alone. And he thinks, and he looks at himself and he says, now if it were me, I wouldn't like to be what? Sitting alone. So he goes to her and he sits down with her and he learns that she lost her husband and that tomorrow would be her 60th wedding anniversary. So he invites her over to the table and they sit and they get acquainted. Talk about being mindful, looking outside of yourself, thinking what's going on, thinking where you are, and reaching out to them too as well. The idea basically in cultural intelligence is simply looking and listening and interacting with people. Recognizing that we may have our prejudgment because of lack of communication with other people. So communicate, listen and talk, but do more listen and talking. You can context, one of the beautiful things I find of ministry that I'm hearing is becoming very effective in evangelism towards millennials and Gen Z. You don't, especially the Gen Z who don't know anything about the Bible, who call themselves the what? The nuns. Inviting them over and developing a relationship and listening to them and listening and listening. And I know, for example, Pastor Flores, here who pastors the Epic Church, he is a master at that. When he sees someone new, he says, let's have a chat. Let's meet at Starbucks and just talk. And you know, that's the master way of truly communicating cross-culturally, cross-generationally. Wasn't Jesus the one who one night, man came up to him and says, can I talk? Who was that? Nicodemus. Jesus spent time listening to him. He tells him what he needs to hear. Unless you're born again, you can't enter the what? Kingdom of heaven. But he sits down with him, talking with him, listening to them. That impacted him, didn't he? It impacted him. How do you increase your cultural competence? Well, these are the basic things. If anything else, this is something you should take note of. Pray. Pray to be, compassionate, to be what? Humble, which means teachable, and teachable too as well. Evaluate your own values and admit your own biases. And we all have them. We all have them. You just have to admit it and then recognize where we need to check on those. Acquire accurate information about other cultures and don't rely on common assumptions. Be intentional associating with people outside of your own culture. Be willing to have an open and honest and open conversation. Understand differences in communication style. Understand what their particular cultural values are. And recognize their values can be different. Individual versus collective, direct versus indirect. We had a situation at the union where the Burmese or the refugee, Southeast Asian, the Asian cultural groups, Mizo, Chin, Zomi, and Karen, they said, we want to learn about small groups. And we heard the Hispanics are excellent in the area of small groups. Can the Hispanics teach us, Karen, how to do small groups? So guess what? It was an amazing thing to happen, but I had 3 Hispanic pastors teaching them in Spanish while they were being translated how to do what? Small groups. Now, keep in mind, in their culture, they're not effective, they're more what? Neutral in their expression, right? Their cultural values, neutral versus effective. And so the pastor who was teaching says, why don't they say something? Why don't they say anything? It's their culture. It's their culture. They are honoring you by listening to you. They're honoring you by listening to you, paying attention. And then the last thing, ask God. And read this with me. Ask God to help you be his instrument of God's marvelous grace to others. You can be an instrument of God's grace. Do you believe that? You can share the grace of God by loving them and caring for them and looking where their needs are. I'm going to now show a closing video here. And actually, it's not a closing video, but it is right at the close almost. A little girl, she wanted to reach and help out people of a different culture. And how her desire to help became an instrument of God's marvelous grace. I'm going to show this video. And it'll be, like I said, near the close here as I show this.